Aliens had studied Earth for 6 years. They picked the one crowd they thought would panic and scatter the instant a ship broke the clouds. They were wrong, because the humans below were not a crowd. They were a rodeo, and in about 90 seconds, an alien commander was going to learn exactly what that horn means. Stick around, because this one gets out of hand fast. If you love a good underdog story, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from before we ride into this one. High Marshal Threx of the Skarn Ascendancy had studied 400 worlds before Earth ever made his target list. His people did not conquer through brute force alone. They conquered through patience, through data, through watching a species long enough to know exactly where its will would break first. For 6 years, a single cloaked observation vessel had orbited quietly above North America, recording everything. Sports events, political rallies, traffic jams, weather disasters. And one strange, recurring gathering that appeared every summer in the state of Wyoming, a 10-day festival the humans called Cheyenne Frontier Days. Threx's analysts flagged it as the perfect target. Massive open grounds, tens of thousands of civilians packed shoulder to shoulder. Loud music, distracted attention, minimal permanent defense infrastructure, no military base within 20 miles. The analysts called it a soft target. Threx liked that phrase. He used it twice in his final briefing to the fleet. His second-in-command, a sharp and skeptical officer named Vantis, was not convinced. She had watched the same footage Threx had, but she had paid attention to different details, not the fireworks. Not the music, the animals, the men on horseback moving cattle with practiced ease. The way a fallen bull rider was on his feet again in under 4 seconds, laughing it off. The rope tricks. The blacksmith competitions. The sheer, casual comfort these humans had with danger. "Marshal," she said, standing beside him on the bridge as Earth grew larger in the viewport, "I want to flag something before we commit the fleet." Threx did not look away from the planet. "Speak, these are not spectators, they are competitors. Every human in that arena has spent years training to control a half-ton animal that is actively trying to throw them off and stomp them into the dirt. We are not walking into a crowd, Marshal. We are walking into a proving ground." Threx allowed himself a short, dismissive laugh. Confidence was a Skarn commander's greatest weapon, and Threx wore his like armor. "Vantis, I appreciate your caution, but look at them. No plasma shielding, no orbital defense grid, no standing army guarding a festival ground. They ride animals for entertainment. This is not a warrior culture. This is a spectacle culture." Vantis said nothing more, but she quietly rerouted a portion of the fleet's medical reserves toward the front lines, just in case. It was a decision that would matter more than either of them yet understood. Below, the sun was setting gold over Cheyenne, Wyoming. The grandstands were full. 60,000 people had come from every direction, from ranch towns and city suburbs alike, to watch the biggest outdoor rodeo on the planet. Bull riders were chalking their gloves in the chutes. A young rancher named Colt Bannerman stood near the fence line with his uncle, Duke Whitfield, a weathered old bronc rider who had ridden this same arena for 30 seasons. Sheriff Hank Boone, the head of Cheyenne's local law enforcement, walked the perimeter with a coffee in hand. Half listening to the announcer over the loudspeakers and half watching the crowd for nothing more dangerous than pickpockets. Nobody in that arena expected the sky to open. At 8:47 in the evening, right as the national anthem singer hit the final note, and the crowd rose to their feet in applause, 3 shapes broke through the clouds above the grandstand. They were not fireworks. They were not planes. They were angular, dark, and utterly silent, hovering exactly where the announcer's booth stood. The applause died in pieces, 1 row at a time, as people looked up. Threx watched the feed from orbit with quiet satisfaction. This was the moment his species relished most, the instant a target population realized resistance was pointless. He waited for the panic. He waited for the stampede toward the exits, the screaming, the chaos that made conquest so efficient. Instead, Colt Bannerman turned to his uncle Duke and said the first words any human spoke to the invasion of Earth. "Well," Colt said, squinting up at the ships, "that's new." Duke did not look impressed. He spat once into the dirt and adjusted his hat. "Boy, get my rope." Above them, the rodeo horn, the same horn that signaled the start of every single event that day, blew one long, defiant note across the grounds. Nobody had told it to. The gate operator, a 60-year-old woman named Ruth Callahan who had worked that horn for 22 rodeo seasons, hit the switch out of pure muscle memory, because in her mind, Something had just entered her arena uninvited, and by God, it was getting announced properly. Threx frowned at the sound blooming across his sensors. Vantis. What was that signal? Vantis checked the audio analysis, and for the first time in the mission, her voice carried the faintest trace of concern. Marshal, I don't think that was a surrender siren. I think that was a starting bell. The first Skarn dropship touched down directly in the center of the arena, crushing a section of freshly raked dirt that had been groomed for the bull riding finals. Its ramp opened with a hydraulic hiss, and 20 armored troopers marched out in a tight formation, plasma rifles raised, fear projectors humming to life along their shoulder plates. A frequency designed to trigger primal panic in mammalian brains. It did not work the way it had on the last 3 planets. The crowd did not stampede. They surged forward against the fence rails, phones raised, some of them laughing in disbelief, several already recording for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. A group of teenagers near the chutes started chanting for the aliens to do a trick. An older rancher near the beer stand muttered, "Now I've seen everything," and calmly finished his drink before standing up. The lead trooper activated his translator. "Citizens of this territory, you are now under Skarn jurisdiction. Remain calm and do not resist." From the announcer's booth, the Rodeo announcer, a fast-talking, unshakable man named Roy Prout who had called Rodeo events through tornado warnings, power outages, and one runaway bull that took out a fence, grabbed his microphone without missing a beat. "Well, folks, looks like we've got some out-of-town competitors joining us tonight, and judging by that landing, I'm gonna give that a 6.5. We've seen smoother dismounts from a green colt." The crowd roared with laughter. The lead trooper's fear projector spiked in intensity, confused by the lack of response. Down near the chutes, Colt Bannerman had already returned with his Uncle Duke's rope, and Duke was tightening it around his palm the same way he had done 10,000 times before a ride. He was not thinking about diplomacy. He was thinking about the fact that something had landed in the middle of his arena during finals night, and that was simply not going to be tolerated. "Duke," Colt said quietly, "that thing's got a gun." "So does half this crowd," Duke replied. "Difference is we know how to use ours without knocking over a fence." The lead trooper raised his weapon toward the nearest civilians, a warning gesture more than an attack. Duke did not wait to see what came next. He swung his rope in one smooth, practiced arc, the same motion he used to catch a calf running full speed across open ground, and lassoed the trooper clean around the shoulders before the alien even registered the movement. One sharp tug, and 30 years of roping muscle pulled the trooper flat onto his back in the dirt. The arena exploded into sound, not screaming, cheering. Sheriff Hank Boone, who had been jogging toward the disturbance with his hand already on his radio, stopped in his tracks and stared. "Did he just rope an alien? Looked like a clean throw," someone behind him said. "Judges would have scored that an 8. Above, Threx watched his trooper get dragged through the dirt on his monitors and felt something he had not felt in decades of conquest. Confusion. Vantis. "Explain what I am looking at." "It appears the local male immobilized our trooper using a rope, Marshal. A technique typically used for capturing livestock. He treated my soldier like an animal." "Yes, Marshal. Statistically speaking, he did it faster than most of his livestock captures on record." "I pulled his competition history. He is regionally ranked." Threx said nothing for a long moment. On the ground, the second wave of troopers advanced toward the chutes, only to be met by a wall of bucking horses that had bolted loose from their pens during the commotion. Spooked by the ship's engines, and now thundering across the arena in a wide, panicked circle. What should have been chaos in the aliens' favor became chaos entirely against them. Riders who had spent their whole lives around spooked animals sprang into the saddle mid-stride, weaving between the horses with practiced calm, while the Skarn troopers, trained for orbital combat and city sieges, had absolutely no doctrine for an incoming stampede of 1,000-pound animals moving at full gallop. 2 troopers were knocked flat before they fired a single shot. A third dove behind a hay bale that promptly caught fire from a stray firework someone had launched in the confusion. Because apparently Cheyenne Frontier Days had a fireworks show scheduled for 9 o'clock regardless of alien invasion status, and nobody had told the pyrotechnics crew to stand down. Roy Prout's voice boomed once more across the loudspeakers, gleeful and completely unbothered. "Folks, I don't know what's in tonight's schedule anymore, but somebody go tell the fireworks crew we've added a new event. Vantis turned to Threx with something close to alarm in her voice. Marshal, our trooper formation is disintegrating. Recommend immediate reinforcement or withdrawal. Threx's mandibles clicked in irritation. Reinforce. I will not be humiliated by animals and rope tricks. He had no idea the night had barely started. Threx deployed his second dropship, this one carrying his elite unit. 12 heavily armored Skarn shock troopers, equipped with riot shields and stun batons, designed to subdue large crowds without lethal force. His logic was simple. If the locals responded to livestock tactics with confidence, overwhelming numbers and non-lethal suppression would restore order quickly. The shock troopers landed near the concession stands, forming a tight defensive line exactly as their training demanded. What their training had never accounted for was a rodeo concession stand at full capacity on finals night, staffed by vendors who had zero interest in closing early for anyone, alien or otherwise. A woman running the funnel cake stand, a stout, no-nonsense grandmother named Peggy Dunlap who had worked that same stand for 11 summers, took one look at the armored line forming near her fryer and picked up the nearest weapon available to her, a full sheet pan still hot from the fryer oil. You are not shutting down my stand during finals, she announced, and swung the pan directly into the nearest trooper's helmet with a crack that echoed over the loudspeakers. The trooper staggered, disoriented, and Peggy followed up with a second swing before calmly turning back to her fryer to check on a batch of curly fries. Nearby, a cluster of ranch hands who had come into town for the rodeo, sunburned, broad-shouldered men named Jake Everson and Tyler Combs, grabbed folding chairs from the beer garden and charged the shock troopers head-on, using the chairs as makeshift shields against the stun batons. It should not have worked. It absolutely should not have worked. But rodeo men fall off angry animals for a living and get back up out of pure stubbornness, and getting hit with a stun baton registered to them as roughly equivalent to a bad bronc kick, which meant they simply shook it off and kept swinging. Threx watched his elite unit, his most disciplined soldiers, get overwhelmed by a grandmother with a sheet pan and 2 men wielding plastic folding chairs. Vantis, he said slowly, how is this happening? Marshall, cross-referencing local data, this specific demographic engages in an activity called tailgating prior to most public events. Alcohol consumption is a factor, pain tolerance appears elevated, risk aversion appears functionally absent. They are drunk, partially Marshall. But I believe the larger factor is that these humans do this specific activity, riding dangerous animals in front of large crowds, entirely for fun. Violence and chaos do not frighten this demographic. It appears to entertain them. Threx stared at the screen as Ricky. No, this was Wyoming, so it was a broad-shouldered rancher named Cody Marsh, who had wandered over from the beer garden with absolutely no context for what was happening, took one look at a downed Skarn trooper's helmet lying in the dirt, picked it up, tried it on, and gave a thumbs up to a nearby group of onlookers who cheered as if he had just completed a successful bull ride. Meanwhile, Sheriff Hank Boone had made his way to the arena's central announcing booth, radio in hand, trying to coordinate what little order he could without technically starting an intergalactic incident on his own authority. He grabbed Roy Prute's spare microphone. Folks, this is Sheriff Boone. I need everybody to stay behind the fence line and let the professionals handle this. A voice from the crowd shouted back, Sheriff, Duke just lassoed one of them. We are the professionals. Boone had no response to that. Above the arena, the Skarn command ship registered something that made even Threx go still. His elite squad's shields, designed to withstand small arms fire, were being systematically stripped and looted by a growing crowd of locals who had realized, correctly, that alien riot armor was worth quite a lot of money on the resale market. A teenager on a four-wheeler had already made off with an entire stun baton, weaving through the parking lot with it held over his head like a trophy. Marshal, Vantis said carefully, I recommend we reconsider the scope of this operation. Threx's claws dug into the command rail. No, we finish what we started. Deploy the walker, Vantis hesitated. Marshal, the walker was designed for urban demolition, not livestock grounds. I do not care what it was designed for. I want that horn to stop blowing. Down below, Ruth Callahan hit the switch one more time, and the horn blew long and loud across the arena, as if daring the sky itself to send down something worth the ticket price. The Skarn armored walker descended through the smoke and floodlights like something out of a nightmare, built for a different planet entirely. 12 meters tall, 4 jointed legs, dual plasma cannons mounted on its shoulders, a fear emitter humming low enough to rattle teeth. It touched down directly on the arena's main dirt floor, crushing a section of fencing meant to hold back 2,000-pound bulls. For one brief moment, the crowd actually went quiet. Then the announcer's voice crackled back over the loudspeakers, and Roy Prout, sounding more amused than afraid, said the line that would end up quoted for years afterward. "Well, folks, looks like they brought their own bull tonight. Only question is whether it can buck." The walker's cannons glowed, sweeping slowly across the grandstand. Threx's voice came through its external speaker, translated and booming. "Locals of this territory, cease resistance immediately, or this structure will be leveled." Down near the bucking chutes, a name got mentioned over the radio that changed the entire tone of the night. Colton Marsh, 26 years old, 3-time PRCA bull riding finalist, had just arrived from the back lot after hearing what was happening. And he was not interested in negotiating with anything that had just threatened his hometown rodeo. Colton did not carry a weapon. He did not need one. He walked straight toward the base of the walker with the same loose, confident stride he used walking toward a chute holding 2,000 pounds of angry bull. And he looked up at its cannon array the way he looked at every animal before a ride, sizing it up, calculating its weak point, deciding exactly where he needed to be when it moved. "Colton, get back!" Sheriff Boone shouted over the noise. Colton ignored him. Instead, he turned to the crowd and raised one arm, the universal rodeo signal for a rider ready to nod for the gate. It was instinct more than strategy, but the crowd understood it instantly, because they had watched this exact gesture their whole lives. A rider was about to do something reckless, and the crowd was about to lose their minds over it either way. The walker's front leg lifted to advance. Colton darted underneath its shifting weight, exactly the way he darted past a bull's horns during a dismount, using the machine's own momentum against it. Grabbing hold of a maintenance strut along its lower joint the way he'd grab a bull rope, and hauling himself up before the machine's sensors could track something moving that close to its own frame. Threx's monitors lit up with warnings. "Vantis, what is that human doing?" "Marshal, he appears to be climbing our walker." "Why?" "I do not know, Marshal." I believe humans refer to this activity as, and I am reading this directly from local commentary, sending it. Colton reached the walker's exposed hydraulic housing near its shoulder joint and, with the kind of improvised, stubborn ingenuity that had kept ranch equipment running across Wyoming for 100 years, jammed a folded pocket knife directly into the mechanism's seam and levered it hard. Sparks erupted. The walker's right arm seized mid-swing, its plasma cannon discharging harmlessly into the empty night sky instead of the grandstand. The crowd roared louder than they had all night. Duke Whitfield, watching from the fence line, allowed himself a rare, proud smile. "That boy's gonna win Buckle of the Year for this." The walker staggered, its balance thrown off by the jammed joint, and 2 more ranch hands seized the opportunity, driving a stolen utility truck directly into one of its rear legs at full speed. It was not a tactical maneuver. It was simply what you did in Wyoming when something large and hostile was in your way and you happened to have a truck. The walker toppled sideways into the arena dirt with a crash that shook the grandstand, its cannons sparking uselessly, its pilot, a Scarn officer named Grelth, shouting into his comms that the situation had become, in his words, tactically unrecognizable. Threx watched his most powerful ground asset get taken down by a rodeo cowboy and a borrowed pickup truck, and for the first time since the invasion began, he felt something colder than anger settle into his chest. "Doubt Vantis," he said quietly. "Prepare the pacification unit." Vantis turned toward him slowly. "Marshal, are you certain that unit has never failed?" "Neither had that walker," Threx said. "Deploy it." The pacification beast dropped from the third ship in a reinforced containment pod that cracked open the instant it hit the dirt. 3 meters tall, 6 limbs, an armored skull built to withstand small arms fire. A roar engineered on a genetic level to trigger paralytic fear in nearly every mammal species the Scarn ascendancy had ever encountered. It stood up in the middle of the arena and let out that roar, and for 1/2 of a second, even some of the toughest ranch hands in the crowd took an instinctive step back. Then a dog barked. Not a large dog. A stout, scruffy blue heeler named Tank, the arena's unofficial mascot, who spent every rodeo season chasing loose calves back into their pens, and had absolutely no concept of a fear response toward anything with 4 legs, 6 legs, or otherwise. Tank belonged to gate worker Ruth Callahan, and Tank had exactly one job description in his entire life, which was making sure nothing that did not belong in the arena stayed in the arena. Tank did not know what a pacification beast was. Tank knew there was an animal loose in his arena that had not been cleared through the gate, and that was simply unacceptable. He launched himself at the beast's leg with the same low, fearless charge he used on runaway calves twice his size. Latching onto its ankle joint, and refusing to let go despite the creature's furious attempts to shake him off. The beast reared back, more startled than harmed, and in doing so exposed a soft plating seam along its underside that had never been tested against anything smaller than an artillery shell. Colton Marsh, still buzzing with adrenaline from the walker, did not hesitate. He grabbed a loose length of rope from a nearby chute rail, the same tool his Uncle Figure Duke had used to bring down the very first trooper of the night, and looped it around the creature's rear leg, exactly the way he'd throw a header on a fleeing steer. "Pull," he shouted, and half a dozen ranch hands grabbed the other end of the rope without a second thought. Hauling together with the same coordinated strength, they used every single day to move stubborn livestock that outweighed them 10 times over. The beast crashed sideways into the dirt, Tank still clamped onto its ankle, barking with the sheer, uncomplicated joy of a dog doing exactly what he was born to do. From orbit, Vantis watched the feed in stunned silence. "Marshall, our Apex bioweapon has been defeated by a rope, 6 ranch workers, and a dog weighing approximately 11 kilograms. Threx said nothing. He simply stared at the wreckage of his walker, his scattered troopers, his stripped equipment being carried off piece by piece into the parking lot, and the small, scruffy dog now proudly standing on top of his fallen pacification beast like it had just won best in show. "Marshal," Vantis said carefully, "orders." Down on the ground, Sheriff Hank Boone finally reached the center of the arena, radio in one hand. Utterly unsure what report he was supposed to file for this. Around him, the crowd had shifted from panic to something closer to euphoric disbelief, cheering every down piece of alien hardware like it was a scored event. Roy Pruitt's voice rang out one final time over the loudspeakers, warm and triumphant. "Folks, I've called a lot of rodeos in my time, but I think that might be the wildest livestock event Cheyenne Frontier Days has ever hosted." High Marshal Threx stood frozen on his bridge, watching his fleet's official casualty and equipment loss report populate in real time. 3 troopers wounded, 2 dropships damaged beyond immediate repair, 1 armored walker disabled, 1 pacification beast subdued by a domestic canine. 42 individual pieces of Skarn equipment reported missing or stolen, including, according to the final line of the report, his own command tablet. Last seen in the hands of a teenager on a 4-wheeler. He closed his eyes. Vantis. Sound the retreat. The remaining Skarn ships lifted off just after 11 that night, ascending unevenly through the smoke and floodlights, one of them missing an entire side panel. Another dragging a length of chain link fence that had somehow gotten welded to its landing strut during the chaos. Below them, the crowd at Cheyenne Frontier Days did something no other planet in Threx's 400-world campaign history had ever done as an invading fleet retreated. They cheered like the home team had just won the finals. Fireworks that had been scheduled for 9 o'clock finally launched at 11:15, arcing bright and gold over a grandstand still buzzing with disbelief, laughter. And no small number of people already telling the story to friends who had missed it, exaggerating details that barely needed exaggerating in the first place. Somewhere near the beer garden, Cody Marsh was still wearing the alien trooper helmet, now signing it like a rodeo buckle for a growing line of kids and grown adults alike. Duke Whitfield coiled his rope back onto his saddle horn with the same calm, unbothered motion he used after any ordinary run, as if wrangling an alien soldier had simply been another Tuesday. Colton Marsh sat on the fence rail nearby, breathing hard, a light burn mark along one sleeve from the walker's sparking joint, grinning the exhausted, satisfied grin of a man who had just turned in the ride of his life. Beside him, Tank the Blue Healer lay curled up, thoroughly pleased with himself, chewing contentedly on a scrap of alien armor plating that nobody had the heart to take away from him. Sheriff Hank Boone stood near the center of the arena long after the crowd had started filtering toward the exits, staring at the scorched dirt. the toppled walker slowly being climbed over by souvenir-hunting teenagers, and the general wreckage of what had, by any technical definition, been a full-scale alien invasion. He radioed his deputy back at the station. "You're gonna want to sit down for this report," he said. "Try me," the deputy answered. "We got invaded by aliens tonight." Rodeo took care of it. There was a long pause on the radio. "Sheriff, have you been drinking?" "Wish I had an excuse that simple," Boone said, and hung up the radio, already dreading the paperwork. High above Earth, aboard the retreating Skarn command ship, Threx sat in silence as his final report populated on the console in front of him. Vantis stood beside him, her tone measured, careful not to sound anything close to satisfied, even though every data point in front of her had proven her right from the very first briefing. "Marshal, the fleet is requesting your official summary for Ascendancy Command." Threx exhaled slowly. "Target designation, Cheyenne Frontier Days. Population assessment incorrect. Local defense capability, unknown variable. Revise all future scouting protocols to include recreational livestock events. Shall I note a recommendation for future contact?" "Marshal," Threx thought of the rope. The dog, the rancher who climbed his walker like it was another animal to be broken. The grandmother with the frying pan. The horn that never stopped sounding across the arena, as if daring his fleet to try again. "Recommendation," he said quietly. "Do not return to this territory. Local population does not register fear as expected. Local population appears to interpret armed conflict as recreational activity. Advise all Ascendancy vessels, this planet's classification requires revision from primitive to unpredictable and hostile by nature." Vantis entered the report without a word, though the faintest trace of something like respect had crept into her posture. Below them, Earth rotated slowly in the dark, and somewhere on its surface, the lights of Cheyenne Frontier Days still glowed long after midnight, loud, chaotic, and entirely unbothered by the fact that it had just repelled an invasion using ropes, folding chairs, a frying pan, and a very determined dog. Back on the ground, as the last firework faded into the night sky, Colton Marsh looked over at his Uncle Duke and asked the only question that mattered. "You think they're coming back?" Duke considered it for a moment, glancing at the wrecked walker still sitting in the dirt, the crowd taking photos beside it and Tank happily gnawing on his trophy. "Nah," Duke said, "but if they do, tell them finals are at 7 next year. They already missed the good bulls, and somewhere far above the clouds. Every navigation system in the Skarn Ascendancy fleet, updated with a single new warning, embedded permanently into their star charts. Not a warning about weapons, not a warning about defenses. A warning that would follow this small blue planet for every future scouting report the Ascendancy ever filed again. Do not land during rodeo season. The locals will rope you, ride you, and sell your equipment before sunrise. If you made it this far, you already know this one deserves a like, and if you want more stories like this, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Drop a comment and tell me what you'd do if you were standing in that crowd when the ships came down. Share this with a friend who needs to hear about the night Cheyenne Frontier Days sent an alien invasion packing. Thanks for riding along, and I'll see you in the next story.